First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming along this evening for what's going to be, I hope, a really insightful, engaging and yes, very challenging conversation about what is one of the big issues of our age, and that is immigration. Not just here in Australia, but we're seeing this in other parts of the world as well. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. I want to acknowledge also my own people, the Wiradjuri, who border this land, and I have deep family connections to Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, so it's nice to be back in a place that I've lived in for quite a while and I have deep connection with as well. I want to welcome you, as I say, and all of you here in the room, and everybody who is joining us online as well. It's lovely to have you with us. We have several sponsors I want to thank who have made this possible tonight. Charles Sturt University, of course, the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture, Rehman Sheriff Group, the Salam Institute and Migration Institute of Australia. As I said, the purpose of tonight is to look at the immigration question. What we're doing well in Australia, what we may be able to do better, what are the lessons we can learn from some of the challenges that we're facing right now and the issues that we see overseas. Here at Charles Sturt and at the ACCNC, we like to infuse what we do with the spirit of Yinjamara. Yinjamara is the governing ethos of Charles Sturt University. It is a Wiradjuri word, way of being, philosophy, theology, a way of life. It speaks fundamentally to the shared space. It speaks to acts of kindness, of participation, of respect, of sitting often in silence, of listening with an open heart. It values often more what we do not say than what we do say. My father summed up Yinjamara, I think, best for me when he said, "It is not about who you are, it is about where you are." And we are here on this land where people have lived and loved and practiced their civilization for tens of thousands of years. And this land infuses the conversation that we're going to have tonight. Immigration, we know, is a hot button issue. It can be very divisive, very polarising. It can be exploited politically, often with devastating consequences. And I would hope that tonight in this room that we're able to engage with that spirit of Yinjamara that recognises that all of us, regardless of where we have come from, regardless of who we are, share something very special, and that is where we are. I want to introduce the panel that we have tonight, who will be carrying this discussion for the next 30, 40 minutes. Then we'll come, hopefully, to some questions from you on the floor. Again, please do not be afraid to ask whatever question you want with the right spirit, good faith and respect, and our panel will be able to try to answer those questions. We have Amy Erickson from St Mark's, CSU, Daniel Gazelbash from the Caldor Centre, UNSW. Next to him is Clive Hamilton from CSU and here at the ACCNC. Alex Kaufman from Playfair and Farhan Rehman Sheriff Group. Farhan also happens to own one of the best chicken shops in Wagga. And if you're ever in now you can give a plug for that, Farhan.
10% off everyone here.
Do not go through Wagga and pass Farhan's. I was hungry one night coming back and waiting for our nephew to arrive at the airport, looking for somewhere to eat. And I stumbled in there and I felt like, we lived in the Middle East for many years and I love the chicken in the Middle East. And I felt like I was right back there. So thank you, Farhan. We're not here to talk about chicken. Although immigration has, of course, widened our palate. So that's something that we absolutely have gratitude for. I wanted to begin, and I'll begin with you, Farhan, because you were part of the genesis of this conversation. It grew out of conversations that you and I had around how we can broach this subject of immigration. You are working as an immigration lawyer for an immigration legal firm. And I wanted to get a sense from everybody about how you see this moment, how you see the challenges of the moment, the things that we may be doing better, the things that we may be doing well. But from your perspective as an immigration lawyer, seeing some of the concerns that are being raised about the increases in immigration that we've seen, particularly post-COVID, those numbers have fluctuated, the nature of that immigration, and what that is telling us about the nature of our society today.
Thank you, Stan, and welcome everyone. My name is Farhan Rahman, and I am from Wagga, proud Wagga boy, and I do own Habibi Chicken from Wagga Wagga, which is certainly an oxymoron. And apart from the 10%, it really does connect a lot of people in Wagga. They love the chicken, and it happens to be called Habibi Chicken. But I mean, the question you've asked, and there's so many aspects to it. I think that from my perspective, my concern, when I look at Australia, one of the concerns I have is that we are not productive as we used to be. We are lacking in innovation, and that is a fact. On the other hand, the conversations that we're having on immigration are contrasting to that. And we're saying, well, we shouldn't have people here. But then we have an aging population. We have skills shortages in logistics, aged care, and various other sectors. And that's the frustration that I have when I view the conversation. It's not really being had from a fact base at all. I think social media is certainly having an impact on it.
Daniel, I'll go to you. Farhan said, we're not having this debate on a fact-based, and it is very emotive, and often anecdotally, you'll hear people make comments about immigration levels that may reflect a feeling they have, or something that they have seen or heard. But let's look at the numbers. We know that there was a post-COVID spike because of pent-up demand after the COVID lockdowns. We saw that drop off, but we've also seen in 2025 a record high of people coming here in permanent migration. So when we look at the numbers, how does that feed into, at the more extreme levels, but also I think generally amongst people, a sense that maybe we're not getting the balance right, or maybe there is a sense that this is moving too fast?
Thanks, Dan. Look, I think the numbers are not really what the issue is, and I think it's the narrative, the story that we tell around those numbers, and it's very easy. I think for as long as we've had democracies, immigrants have been a scapegoat for grievances. They can be a really easy distraction for not having proper policy solutions, but. Yeah, and so I mean that's to go back to ancient Greece, and it was happening in the Agora when they were debating. So the numbers. It's also very difficult for us to win the argument when we start talking about the numbers, because numbers are so abstract. I mean, net overseas migration. Very few people can explain to you what even that actually even means in practice. What people hear is their leaders of this country telling them that number is too high, and that's why they react to it.
And just to jump in there, we often don't differentiate, do we, between the quantitative and qualitative numbers, where people are coming from. When we hear concern about immigration, it's fair to say, at least anecdotally, it's not people necessarily looking at people who may be from the traditional sources of immigration, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, but it represents something else, doesn't it?
So don't quite get your question, Stan. Is it just in terms of the makeup of?
Yeah, in terms of the concerns that we're hearing, is this about the overall number or about the people that they are seeing coming? That there is a sense that there is a change in the makeup itself?
I think, to a certain extent, maybe both of those things. But actually, I think there's something else at play here, which is just general grievances, often grievances that have absolutely nothing to do with immigration at all. The cost of living crisis, number one. The cost of housing and the housing shortage in Australia. And it's such an easy distraction to point the finger at immigration. It's very believable at an intuitive level that immigration is to blame. The facts tell a different story, but it's a very easy one-liner that can be whipped up on social media and also by politicians.
Clive, I'll bring you in on this because you do a lot of work around social cohesion. You look at changing societal trends. To the extent that that narrative bites, why does it?
Well, let me start from a different point, which is not one usually considered in this immigration debate. In 2005, when I ran the Australia Institute, we did a survey of Canberrans to ask them whether they thought the size of Canberra was too small, about right, or too big. And the results showed that almost 3/4 of Canberrans said that Canberra is either about the right size or too big. In other words, almost 3/4 of Canberrans were in favour of zero population growth for this city. In 2005, Canberra's population was 325,000. Today, it's 483,000. And it's expected that by 2050, it will be 700,000. Now, we also asked, or had the surveyors ask Canberrans, those who thought Canberra was the right size or too big, what they thought the damage to harm would be if Canberra grew bigger. And most of them talked about a decline in the quality of life, driven the first thing, or the most common factor they mentioned, was environmental problems. Some close to 80% mentioned that as what they feared from a bigger population. Others mentioned traffic congestion, and some mentioned social problems like crime. Now, Canberra is the most progressive, non-racist jurisdiction in Australia. And yet, of course, the wishes of 3/4 of the population of Canberra were completely ignored. Treated really, when we asked, got reactions from various, the powers that be, they were really quite contemptuous. They don't really know, they don't understand. People don't get what it would be if Canberra didn't grow. I mean, these were people who were developers or politicians who were very close to developers, or many of the demographers that occupy the airwaves in Australia. So, in other words, the wishes of Canberrans were ignored, as we knew they would be. But I think it's perfectly legitimate for people to want to protect the quality of their environment and to worry about social cohesion as a result of uncontrolled growth. But these views are treated with contempt, particularly by the Liberal consensus. And look at the disastrous consequence around the world of ignoring those concerns. I mean, people are now seriously talking about Nigel Farage being the next Prime Minister of Britain. So I just think that this debate has been captured for far too long by the Liberal opinion that dominates the media, that exploits Liberal opinion in industry, and by politicians who are afraid to speak up for these kinds of concerns. And it means that more extreme views motivated by racism are allowed to emerge.
It's interesting, you've raised two things there. There is the capacity for people of bad faith to exploit what are legitimate, genuine and felt anxiety that is not heard and doesn't get a voice.
And we see exactly the same thing happening in the trans debate.
Yeah.
There are legitimate views, legitimate differences of opinion from well-meaning people on that issue.
Yeah.
And yet those who have serious concerns about some elements of certainly the trans lobby, held down, abused, silenced. I mean, I'd say that 90% of academics in Australia, perhaps 98%, are too afraid to venture their opinions in public on the trans issue.
And similarly, immigration becomes a hot button.
Indeed.
I want to come to you in just a moment, Amy, because there is a theological aspect to this that I'd like to explore. But Alex, it's unavoidable, isn't it? And we go very quickly to the pointy end of this debate because we are seeing it everywhere. Certainly in the United States, it's been a mobilising factor on the political right. We're seeing it in the UK, in Europe especially, and we can come to some of the individual cases there. But in Australia, we don't have a lot of the pressing issues that you have in those other places, which are density of population, shared national borders that can directly impact on your own sovereignty and your own policy settings, extremes of economic disparity in places like the United States, which exacerbate just these pent-up frustrations, deeply polarised partisan media. There are a lot of things that mitigate the worst of those aspects, and yet we are seeing neo-Nazi protests, and we are seeing a sharp uptick in opinion polling for groups like One Nation, and we're seeing in the Liberal National Coalition across a whole range of fronts a reaction to what they're perceiving as some of the things that Clive has touched on, the unvoiced or unlistened to concerns of others. So are we in Australia heading down the path that we see in other countries where the issue itself may be more acute?
Well, these tipping points or inflection points are a consequence of everything that's been spoken about here today. It's very tempting to think that maybe, you know, with an ageing population, there might be a drift to conservatism and everything that might come along with that in terms of change and its impact on the cultural hegemony that people might adopt within themselves. But you're right, there's been plenty of other people and groups that have been co-opted into this, what looks like a Trojan horse in perhaps the US, for example. You're having legitimate issues that are baked into a proposition that, you know, that no one else is talking about it. So I have to take on everything else with that. We don't have quite that in our political discourse, but everything else that feeds into that is happening right now. Definitely. I mean, I grew up on the Northern Beaches, Stan, so I'm the first one to know what an insular little micro...
So did my wife. She's laughing about that in the...
And it took me 30 years...
She now has the most diverse family you could possibly imagine.
Well, I really enjoy taking my two girls, 9 and 15-year-old daughters, to Eid at Campsie, you know, and it's not something that I would have contemplated in my youth. So, you know, there's some... you know, fairly long-standing ideas about what the face of Australia should look like, or does.
Yeah, that question of the face of Australia I want to come to, but I also want to drill down with Farhan in a minute about the sheer economics of this. We do have an ageing population. We do need to bring people in to do the work. We know who's doing a lot of the heavy lifting in a lot of the industries that are crying out for more people. So how we manage that. But there is, Amy, a theological question to this as well that I'd like to bring you in on. We saw in the United States when the Pope criticised the immigration policies there, and we saw J.D. Vance, who is a Catholic, quoting St. Augustine and talking about the Ordo Amore, the order of love, and that while as a Christian, and we're speaking here at the ACCC, while as Christians there is a call to welcome the stranger, which is fundamental to the faith, that there also is an Augustinian idea that that does not mean that all people are loved in the same way at the same time, and love takes various forms. There's a whole theological debate about that and what J.D. Vance got right or wrong. The Pope may know a little bit more than all of us when it comes to that. But what do you, looking at this through a theological lens, going to some of the issues that Clive's raised as well about the anxiety and the lack of awareness or concern about recognising that anxiety, listening to people, how that feeds into this. From a theological perspective, how do you speak into this moment to open up spaces of love to be able to have what are very, very difficult conversations?
Right, yeah, excuse me, I think that is the question. First, let me confess I'm part of that post-COVID spike. I mean, Daniel, you mentioned narratives around numbers, but I think what interests me is what's the narrative around belonging, home, what it means to be a nation that's fueling some of that polarization that we're seeing here, which obviously parallels some of the polarization in my country. And I think, yeah, what a theological perspective can bring is it can press that question of what is the story that's undergirding these different flashpoint polarizations. And I mean, Christians shouldn't be deceived into thinking that others should buy into their own narrative that they live from. But I think what a Christian perspective can do, if you look at the arc of the biblical narrative, one of the kind of driving themes is this theme of migration, that we are all migrants existentially as humans. We're all on our way home. And there's different moments in the biblical narrative when God's people are told, welcome the foreigner because remember that you were foreigners once. And so I think that what the Christian narrative can do is it can give us a new baseline for how we frame immigration. If we see it as not an anomaly to the human condition, but actually essential to it. And I think that's likely to generate postures and policies more of welcome than of exclusion.
And yet, as we see in the United States and we see in Europe, a Christian nationalism that is very much being driven by some of the anxieties around immigration. We see people like Viktor Orban in Hungary speak to this. We see in the UK and other places as well that there is a sense that we are protecting a Christian heritage that is at risk, not just from migration, but to be frank, the type of people who are coming, who are criticised for not being able to assimilate into a Christian society, and therefore the very fundamental basis of Western Christianity is at stake. That's a snapshot, but that is a very powerful narrative, a very powerful Christian narrative. That's not speaking necessarily to the theology that you were just advocating.
Right. Yeah, no, it's at root is a profound theological error that mistakes Christian belief and identity with ethnicity and race. Which, if you read the scripture, especially the New Testament, it's very clear that submission to the lordship of Christ transcends ethnicities and is able to unite people across ethnic difference without erasing those differences. And so there's been a profound error theologically in some of that Christian nationalism.
I want to bring Clive in on that in just a moment, Clive. Just have a think about how you may answer that. But I want to go to Farhan just quickly. And if I might, Farhan, here,
Sure.
Invite a personal recollection. Because you have come here from the sort of countries that the country, and representing a sort of people that are precisely in the frame in Europe.
Wagga Wagga.
Or in the United States. But you come to Wagga, you grow up with Aboriginal people.
Absolutely.
You play football.
Yeah.
You go and study, but you move back to Wagga to live in Wagga.
Yeah.
You own a chicken shop in Wagga. You are part of that society, and I've spoken to you about this personally in the past. The conscious decision of your family about assimilating into an Australian culture, to be Australian. How did that play out in your life? What were the decisions that were made? And do you see that frame? Do you see that maybe there is not either A, a culture necessarily for people to assimilate into, or B, a reluctance or resistance from people to even want to assimilate into that? So two things, your own story and your reflections on where we are now.
Sure. Well, I was born in the United Kingdom and my father moved from the United Kingdom when I was 5 years old. My father's originally from Pakistan. He did his PhD in molecular biology, much more smarter than I am. And he moved to Australia. We initially were in Newcastle to Adelaide to Horsham to Wagga. And I think the journey for us as a migrant family, quote unquote, was a little bit different because we didn't go to the cities. So we didn't get the opportunity, or maybe I found later in my life that was a disadvantage, to find people alike. So we just, we were in Wagga and my mates they weren't Ahmed, they were, Tom and Michael and whoever else, right? And I think that journey there probably I didn't realize at that time, that journey had a huge impact on me because when I went to the cities, I didn't really see the whole race thing. It didn't really impact me at all. And so for me, it was very simple. I don't think my parents did anything magical, but of course, gave me the right upbringing, both my mother, both my parents. But I don't think they did anything in particular to say, well, you are Australian. I think it just kind of happened, right? For me, it's not complex at all. I'm Australian because I'm in Australia, and I happen to be a Muslim. Simple and plain. And beyond that, that's what I teach my children as well. Yes, they've got a heritage and their grandparents speak a certain language. Unfortunately, because my wife doesn't speak the official language, which is Urdu, I'm starting to lose that a little bit, which is no good. But I don't see the need to make it all very complex. It's very
But
simple.
it was very organic for you.
Yeah.
And yet the pushback, the tension points
Sure.
are around this question of national identity. When someone says, I'm losing my country, there's an idea of a country, often nostalgic, but very real, as Clive has pointed out to them. Do you see that changing? Are the pathways, is the same sense of a culture to become a part of, the idea of being Australian has obviously changed because the nature of the country changes. Is it as simple, if I want to use that word, as it may have been when you came here? Keeping in mind, of course, that from Pakistan your family went to England and then here, so there was already a migrant story built into that. But is it as simple as it was then?
It's a very good question, Stan. Is it more difficult now than ever? I feel very disconnected from the youth in particular, because that's where you find out what's going on. But based on what Amy said, which I thought was so powerful, and I believe this, since the dawn of time, we've been migrating. You know, on Hammond Avenue, there's a shop called Khan Signs, and you walk in there, and the bloke is as Aussie as you'll get, but he'll tell you my forefathers were Afghan, right? The Afghan Cameliers that built, the entire Australian railway tracks, right? And that's just the nature of migration. We've been doing it. Like, all of us are from different places when you look at it from that perspective. I think that the salient question here, however, is what does Australia mean? What does it mean to be Australian? I think that is the question that needs to be answered, Stan. Because yes, we can talk about economics, we can talk about all of these things, but that particular voice that's becoming louder, I think that is the question that they want answered.
I want to come to you, Daniel, on that in just a moment. But Clive, that question, what is Australian in 2025? And then I'll follow up with what Amy raised before about the nature of politics and Christian nationalism. But what is Australian 2025?
You're not going to suck me into that one, Stan. I mean, we love to debate this, and every pundit has a view and they wheel it out every year, and they're usually boring and cliched. Identity, we are our identities. And we have our individual identities and we have our collective identities, which we typically call our cultures. And cultures and identities are not just extremely important to us, they are who we are. And when the foundations of cultures and identity feel tremors, we become afraid, we're destabilised, we lose our sense of place in the world. Now, some of us, because of our upbringing or disposition, have a much more cosmopolitan approach to our lives and our view of the world, and we can travel easily from one place to another, from one culture to another.
David Goodhart, I think you must have read, of course, made that distinction between the somewheres and the anywheres. The anywheres who can be comfortable anywhere, and the somewheres who are very located, very local, often very regional. Well, that's becoming a fault line, isn't it?
Well, and I agree with, I think, was it Liz Truss who said that if you regard yourself as a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. And that notion of being a citizen of the world is absolutely the conception of self of the global elite. They pride themselves on that. In other words, they actively break and repudiate their national connections. That's why I think it's wrong, not just wrong, but dangerous to dismiss as conservative, backward-looking, racist, narrow-minded people who express their concerns about what they perceive to be threats to their culture. I think it has to be taken very seriously. And, we in Australia have these debates, and, I in no way want to understate the role of scapegoating and racism in Australia. But we do need to keep it in perspective. And those of us who have travelled a bit will get a sense of this. I mean, if you're a black man in Japan or China, I mean, that's off the charts compared to what happens in Australia. And so we do also need to recognise that, you know, it's not all bad, you know, most of us recognise immigrants from wherever they come as Australians once they've settled. It was someone I knew, he was talking about a bloke he worked with he said, oh, he's from India. He said, oh, but he's as Aussie as. And I thought that was perfect. He's as Aussie as. And it was just captured what it means to be a welcoming culture.
Politically, though, and you touched on this with Nigel Farage, we've seen it, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and there's a whole lot of others. I mean, you see it in France with the rise of the right there, Germany. And it is tied around a sense, just to go to that question that you've raised about taking seriously the sense that, for want of a better phrase, the one that we often hear a lot, I don't know where my country's gone, I have lost my country, which is often tied to a nostalgic sense or a comforting sense of what it is to be Christian, or a Christian nationalism, a Christian relationship to the West, a foundation of the West, even for people who may not be practicing Christians themselves, but it becomes that. Why is that a very powerful narrative? We're starting to see it in Australia, but you start in Europe and the United States, the idea that we are losing a heritage, a foundation of our society. And how do we have that conversation, taking it seriously, giving respect to the people who have those feelings, but being able to talk through that?
Well, I'm not a Christian, but I am a fellow traveller. You know, being a white person who grew up in Canberra, I was kind of steeped in the culture in way. We never went to church or anything like that, but it just soaked into the culture of white Australia, whether you were a Christian or not. But the question of who owns Christianity is as old as Christianity itself, isn't it? I mean, you know, so we ought not to be surprised, I think, at the rise of Christian nationalism, because Christianity is, for those who so claim it, part of people's identity, of who they are. And for many, it melds perfectly with their sense of nation and nationhood. So in a way, you know, they're perfect complements in the sense that they sustain and bolster, for many people, a sense of who they are, which is why they cling to both of those so closely. But yeah, once again, I just think we should take, particularly we cosmopolitans, if I can use that we, need to take these senses of identity and connection to culture very, very seriously and not disparage that. I mean, Indigenous people were the first in Australia to say, weren't they, oh, they've stolen my country. I don't know where my country's gone. So, you know, we need to bear that in mind. And we, you know, good lefty cosmopolitans, you know, that's very legitimate, and of course we must respect that.
We also forget that the majority of Aboriginal people are Christians, and the fastest growing and youngest demographic of Catholics in Australia are Aboriginal people, which also shows that, you know, we are very complex in the way that we assimilate other things into our own cultures. And you know, Daniel, you've been sitting here very patiently listening to a lot of this, and I want to sort of pull together some of the strands of it, because clearly we've gone to where the fault line is in this perception of what identity is, what a nation is, who belongs, the rate of migration, the voices who are not listened to. But then underpinning that as well, Farhan touched on this to begin with, there is an economic reality. The nation state is not the nation state that I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s. It is far more economic, it is far more transactional. I can hop on a plane tomorrow and I can fly to the United States and in a couple of years take a test and become an American. And what does that say? Am I now an American? What's my relationship to that country, its history? What does Australia mean if I can throw that cloak off and become something else? Australia is a vastly different country than the country that I grew up in, which was overwhelmingly white. I was the darkest skinned person in most of the classrooms that I sat in. That nourishes a country, it also challenges a country. So underpinning that, though, is an economic imperative. Part of the reason that we've seen rapid movement of people, apart from the push factors of violence and conflict, are also the pull factors of economics, economic opportunities, that people have transactional relationships to nations, but they don't necessarily have spiritual, historical, or social and cultural relationships to a nation. So how do we marry the economic imperative of bringing people here to be able to continue to grow the economy, meet the demands for services, increase productivity, yet at the same time have the conversation about where those fault lines are, about who actually belongs and what it means to belong?
Yeah, so I might actually start by acknowledging one of the points that you made, Clive. And I really agree with you that the worst thing we can do is to dismiss attitudes we disagree with, or label anyone who is against migration as being racist. And the biggest tragedy of our times, maybe not the biggest, one of the biggest tragedies of our times is just our inability to have conversations across divides. And by dismissing views like that, you don't set yourself up as a success. There's no way you can have that conversation. And I think the anxieties that you mentioned, Clive, are very real. They seem to be programmed into our DNA as human beings, and they've always been there. We have come a long way, though, and I think maybe it is worth taking a step back and looking at Australian history and politics. And even before federation, our state governments were competing with one another to have more and more restrictive and punitive policies to keep out Chinese migrants from the states. Our constitution was developed in the context, very front of mind in our constitution was the desire to be able to keep away...
The White Australia policy.
So even before any non-white people, the very first act of parliament we ever had expelled Pacific Island workers from Australia. Shortly after, it was followed by the White Australia policy. And that lasted a very long time to quite recently. And I've spoken to people who worked in the department in the 1960s, as late as the 1960s, and the brief was much more simple. It is, I think, Farhan, you would be out of a job when it comes to advising people on immigration law. It was look at the photo. Three bureaus. There was a European bureau, a mixed bureau, and a non-European bureau. And they all had very easy briefs. The European bureau was, yes, grant the visa. The non-European bureau was deny all the visas. And the mixed bureau had to examine the photo to try and identify whether the person looked white enough. And they told me they literally had training, because it was black and white photos, not to look at the color, but actually the features and like of a person's nose in order to say whether they're white or not. And we have come a long way since then, since the 1960s. And it has come through political leadership and actually bipartisan support for migration. And it actually came at the cost of my main area of expertise, which is refugee policy. And there was, in fact, the same person that was telling me about this story was one of the architects of some of the more restrictive asylum policies that we've had. And I've heard this from many politicians as well that I've spoken with, that actually the harsh asylum policies that we have are essential in order to maintain public support for multiculturalism and for a broad migration program. And that story was told to me as justification for looking at how far we've come. I think what is really concerning, Stan, is that we're losing that bipartisan support for migration, and it came in part because there was no longer a politically salient issue to be fought around refugee issues, because both major parties have now adopted the same very restrictive measures. And there's a dog whistle politics we saw before about refugee issues, which made refugee issues such a big election issue, just wasn't viable anymore. And the coalition made the decision in the lead up to the last election to try it on with migration instead.
And we also saw from Labor changes, particularly that affected the education sector, and that was driven largely because of that concern, or to counter what they saw as a narrative from the other side.
Yeah, really what has happened as a result is, and I'm very familiar with this because it happened in the refugee space long before the migration space, is that we've lost the space for courageous political leadership to make the case for the benefits of migration, to lead those really difficult conversations that we need to have to bring the public along with us.
I'll go to you also on this, Alex, and just with a little anecdote of my own. One of the things when you live in Sydney is that you see the frustration, you see the pent-up anxiety. And one of the real concerns, and I think where people are exposed to this in a very visceral way, is just on the road. You'll see people employed for very little, peddling bikes in the driving rain or riding motorbikes around to deliver food to people's houses. And I often look at that and think, what is the pathway? They may have come on a student visa, they may have whatever. What is the pathway for people here to be Australian, to become a part of this culture, to have children, to have a long-term future? If it is just an exploitative model, if it is just someone here to get an education, deliver some pizzas in the meantime, get in someone's way on the road, cause people to go, what's happening to my city? Why is it such a mess? All of these things feed into it. Has there been a danger in getting that mix wrong, in the pathways, in the things that Farhan talked about before, building, holding on to something that is at the core of what an Australianness may be, that other people can become a part of? Is this also part of it, that the people who are coming here to do these jobs, or to work in the aged care sector, or to do the jobs that other people are not doing who are here, are not necessarily going to have Farhan's experience, are not going to have that pathway into becoming Australian, and then are met with the hostility of others who look at it and say, all that's happening here is they're clogging up my damn roads and getting in the way, and what's happened to my city?
Well, look, without giving a sort of a technical treatise of the criteria associated with different programs, the student visa program has been variously considered the loose cannon and also the darling of the program. So most of your DoorDash and Uber Eats people are here on foundation courses or on student visas by and large. By contrast, in the aged care sector, there are very clear pathways to Australian permanent residence through initiatives of the current administration, through labour agreements and so on. So there is an itinerant working class. It's not as bad as UAE and Dubai and so on, where you can be a permanently temporary person. There was lots of policy machinations around this. We don't want to have that kind of system. But at the end of the day, it's very difficult now to put the throttle on these temporary visa feeder programs, which are perhaps causing most of the distress. They're the most visible.
And do you think also when it comes to housing is also part of the distress?
Yes, although with the student visa cohort, most are really in purpose-built student accommodation facilities. They put very little overall pressure. There are quite a few here. There's no doubt about that. So there's plenty of layers of this onion. But if we do talk about, as I've been practicing in the economic program for 20-odd years, even the high net worth program, but certainly employer-sponsored models, I was musing to myself today what it would like palpably feel like to rip out all the 457, 482 visa holders in the country at the moment. It would be entirely dysfunctional. Of course, you could argue that we didn't have a chance to wind up to that point. But they really are propping up our IT, our healthcare, our aged care, our education systems, performing of the best in the engineering disciplines. And I think just today, Canva had overtaken Atlassian as the biggest disruptor, contemporary Australian business currently on the ASX. Now, Atlassian was very, very famously came out 5-6 years ago saying, look, we've got a lot of 457 visa holders. We've got 250. That's about a quarter of the workforce, and if it wasn't for that, we would not be here. We'd be where the action is, overseas. So, they are job multipliers in many cases as well, Stan.
Amy, we're going to come to some questions from you out there. If you've got some questions in the room, which I'm sure you'd have. You were reflecting that you were part of that post-COVID boom yourself. And I just wonder if you can draw on your own reflections, where you've come from and what you're seeing there, where you have come to, and your own experience anecdotally and also, empirically, about the shifts that we were perceiving, both in attitude, anxiety, versus the realities of immigration.
So you mean the shifts around those polarizations?
Yeah, the shifts around that, and
across the world?
how you may have seen that, experienced that as someone who has come from the outside into Australia, and what the differences may be from where you have come.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is, I have been here the last 4 years since things have gotten really polarized in the States, and so I have been kind of out of the loop and watching it from afar, but then seeing some of the kind of parallels and the effect here. So say more about what you don't like me to comment on. Just what strikes me.
Yeah, I think are we importing something in America that may be much more acute? Is this a political cultural thing, or is this something that is much more tangible?
Yeah. I guess that's the question that I'm asking myself too. What's fueling these polarizations? What's the narrative? And I think you touched on earlier, and you asked how do we actually hear out a far right nationalist? I don't know if I've had a proper conversation with a far right nationalist. And as we've already discussed, what's happened to our public discourse world over, such that there aren't the conditions and places for us to really have those hard but transparent conversations that get past the headlines that are kind of sensational and maybe the marches. And it seems to me, Stan, you have the perspective of what needs to change in our public discourse, and obviously you're trying to do that right now. And how we're facilitating this panel.
I think we need to have the conversations, and we don't have outlets for that. But Clive, even the language, if we talk about people who express what you've correctly identified as being legitimate to their own experience of the world, as far-right nationalists, that also becomes part of the problem, isn't it? They may not be far-right, they may be expressing something that's much more deeply felt, personal.
Indeed, and it's counterproductive, because you push them into the arms of the far right. That feels like, if all of these people are telling me that I'm wrong, but these people over here are saying, yeah, you're right, come over with us. I mean, that's why this is a shocking situation where Nigel Farage has got more votes in the polls than the Conservatives, and indeed the Labor Party. I mean, even 5 years ago, that would have been unheard of. And it's driven primarily about migration anxieties. And I take the point, incidentally, of the way in which often refugee migration is mixed into the broader migration issue, and that sometimes poisons it. And so certainly good information is essential there. But I just want to, there's one argument that's come up that is I want to just push back on, and this is the question was mentioned a couple of times about we need more migrants because of the ageing of the population. Now, Australia is not unique in the ageing of our population at all. But if you think about it, well, where does that argument end? I mean, the natural growth rate of population isn't going to suddenly shoot up. And so this argument about we need to bring in more migrants to overcome, to stop that hump moving through, the population distribution, to drag it back to a younger average. That will go on forever. I mean, sooner or later we have to bite the bullet. We have to find ways of dealing with the ageing of the population.
Does that mean, and we have seen things around increasing retirement age, keeping people in the workforce longer, retraining people. That's a whole different policy conversation, isn't it?
Precisely.
And we're not having that.
Precisely. Giving more respect to people. Someone who's now 72, I think I deserve a lot more respect.
You're ageing very well, my friend.
Than I get. And so I think that this would be a really deep cultural and social change, but I think it's one we have to confront sooner or later. Because, for all kinds of reasons, the main one being, as I just said, and already, we think of this as a wide brown land and we can have 50, 100 million people, but we're not a wide, a big country when it comes to habitability. We're a narrow green strip down the east coast, basically, and a bit over there in Western Australia. And so we need to get over this mentality, I think, and start thinking really ecologically about, well, what can we accommodate? And we see disputes breaking out about extension, about extensive development and intensive development breaking out all over the country. And that can only get worse because we're pushing up against hard limits. So, but this is just a conversation that at a general level, our political leaders really don't want to have. And so they're imposing solutions on communities that are really opposed to it. And they're often, wealthy, powerful, middle-class, white communities too. But more often we see the impacts of this imposed on less powerful, less wealthy communities. I
promise we'll come now to questions in the audience. But one more thing, Clive, and it's been staying in my mind from your very first answer when the survey was undertaken in Canberra in 2005, and essentially people said, Canberra's big enough, thank you very much, we don't want any more. Is that the case at a national level? Are people saying, we're big enough, I don't want a 40 million Australia, we'll get by on what we're doing, and are people prepared to live with the consequences that come from saying that's enough, which means eventually things do slow down?
Well, I haven't seen any recent surveys, but I'd bet money that a large majority of people would say, yes, we're big enough, or too big. And if you went to people's individual communities, I bet you if you did a survey in Wagga now, people would say, no, we don't want Wagga to be any bigger. There's too much traffic coming in here, it's bustling. We didn't move to Wagga to grow into a large rural metropolis. People sort themselves into the communities where they feel comfortable for all kinds of reasons, including their size. And
I might just jump in here, Clive.
Yeah.
However, the other problem is there's not enough housing in Wagga. So, that's a problem that we do face. And I think in Australia, we probably have to let go of the idea that we're going to get a big block of land. I think medium density is something that we need. And so I think even when you look around Canberra, you see all these buildings that are coming up that I never used to see when I was much younger. I think it's for a reason. In Europe, when you go to Europe, it's very common to see medium density and people living in apartments. I think in Australia, we've got this idea that we have to have a block of land.
But you know what that does, Farhan? Then someone says, you're taking my Australia away. I'm entitled to a block of land. That's how I grew up. It's my parents grew up. What are we bringing all these migrants in for? Because now I can't have my block of land. You can see how that... So there are social, there are political, there are economic, there are policy implications for all of that, aren't there?
But Stan, did the question becomes, is it because of migration the prices of property went up in the first place? That's what we have to question. And I think that's an infrastructure issue where we haven't planned for decades and decades. And now we've got to the end of it where we certainly have an undersupply of housing. And yes, things have got higher and higher. And there's also economic issues. We have an office in the UAE and I go there and the cost of property is so high, much, much more than Australia. So this is like a global phenomenon that we're seeing, that the prices of property are increasing in lots of places where people are coming. But I think also in Australia we face a lack of planning. That's my perspective.
I will go to some audience questions. I think I have one here ready to go, and then we'll come to others in the audience as well. But Shefali Williams, there you are. And you may have a comment or question.
I guess I heard a few things coming out about exploring what sort of Australia we want, and also, not assuming that if someone is for something, they're against something else, kind of thing. And I just wanted to mention that I'm from the Baha'i community, and the Baha'i community for the last 8 years or so is exploring how we can have a more socially cohesive and inclusive society. It's an ongoing national project called Creating an Inclusive Narrative. I can speak a lot about it, but I'll just make 3 brief points. One of the things that we're doing is inviting very diverse perspectives from as many organizations, individuals, academics, whoever it is, to come and respectfully share their perspective so that we can explore where are we coming from and where are we now and where do we want to be, and try and come to a consensus about our shared aspirations and try and build trust. So one of the things that we frame our discussions is with Baha'i consultation, where when you present your idea, you become detached from it. It's the group's idea after that to explore. And once again, not have this atmosphere where, if you're for this, to just assume that you are against something else. And the couple of other things that are at the basis is the recognition that we are all interconnected. So just as the human body has different parts, and when they're all functioning well, we thrive, same way communities are made up of different cultures, different people, and all these diverse elements, when they are heard, when they are valued, we thrive. And when someone is, stricken by whatever, we are all there to support. And maybe a question to explore, because we've got a few lawyers on the panel and we've heard from the legal perspective, is how do we reconceptualize justice beyond just talking about legal systems? And for justice to become a tool where community can take it and develop, take ownership of their own development, and recognize this interconnectedness.
That's great. Alex, do you want to take that one? It's a great question, the whole concept of justice, because as Clive would have pointed out, it's a question that goes both ways. It's the justice for the person arriving, it's the justice for the person here, and that each are heard and each find a way to belong. But Alex, take it away.
In terms of belonging, firstly, what was your name?
Shefali Williams.
Shefali Williams.
Yeah.
So I have very fond memories of the Baha'i temple in Terry Hills. Even as an atheist, all throughout my childhood, it was a lovely place to visit, very inclusive. And from that inclusivity aspect, I just wanted to say, even though I spent a lot of my time in the commercial cut and thrust commercial program of immigration, I did have the benefit of representing a interfaith network of 22 different religious organisations that would otherwise make extremely strange bedfellows, I can assure you. And they're all coming together to amend what's called a Minister of Religion Labour Agreement. It was a labour agreement that allowed you to get a Minister of Religion, sponsor a Minister of Religion, but it looked very much like a commercial platform. So you had to pay minimum salary, and it didn't really suit a lot of the organisations that weren't the majors, for example. Now, having said that, we did have some major Abrahamic religions turn up in support of the others in the interfaith network, even though they could meet the criteria for the previous one. So for a year and a half, I got to observe these different religious orders and organisations learn more, become more inclined to learn more and to interact with their opposite numbers. And there were some very, very disparate, if you'd like, spiritual ideas on that panel. But it was a fascinating experience. Tony Burke is quite supportive of the multi-faith, multicultural platform. He runs on a platform like that. And so he was able to facilitate that. And I can see some real-world, tangible, palpable advances in that, with the migration program being the connective tissue. So I was very happy to be a part of that.
Yeah. Nick as well, Nick Houston's here. We were chatting before, Nick, about your idea of the migration test and how that may be reformed to be able to speak to the social cohesion that maybe some are seeing we're lacking. Your question?
Yeah, well, that's right. So, I've practiced migration law for 23 years, and a lot of that was in Mexico City, and I'm sort of helping Mexicans and Latin Americans in general apply to migrate to Australia. And I've come to view the migration program like a big boa constrictor, and the start of the process is that the boa constrictor eats the person passes through many different kinds of visas and processes inside the belly of the beast, and finally the nirvana is to pass out the end of the snake. And at that point, that you become an Australian citizen. And then the question is, well, what do people know about Australia at the time that they become a citizen? And the way it works is that you have to meet certain legal criteria for residence in Australia. You have to be a permanent resident, but you also have to pass a citizenship test. And in that citizenship test, the government gives people information about Australia. And there's two parts of that information. There's parts that is...
Is this the famous Don Bradman batting average question? Or
I wouldn't mind that question myself.
99.96?
Well, yeah, John Howard, I think...
99.9.
John Howard was concerned that people take this citizenship test, but then the question is, what does it say? Or what are the questions that people get asked? And there's a testable component, and with about Australian values and Bradman's final batting average, and there's a non-testable component in terms of the information that is given. And this is where we come back to this broader question of racism that many migrants are subject to, and the whole issue of the fear about the right wing using this opportunistically to manipulate for their own political agenda. But it also affects Indigenous people here in Australia as well. And it was very clear, I think, at the time of the Voice referendum, and it was that slogan, if you don't know, vote no. And not only did that resonate with ignorant Australians, and that's a lot of us, because a lot of us don't know much about the true history of this country in terms of Indigenous issues, but also new migrants, because guess what the non-testable information, guess what that doesn't test? The colonial history. So these new migrants answer 20 questions about what it means to be an Australian. None of it is testable in terms of the Indigenous history of Australia. So we've got a small proposal that we want to take up now, that the citizenship test be amended and the information be changed to give more emphasis to the true history of this country in terms of Indigenous issues, the series of massacres and the way that the land was alienated from the black community to the white community, and have that tested in the citizenship test. So there's a little bit of opportunity for new migrants to come to pass that test with a little bit of understanding about the history. So
I'll get an answer for that from
Yeah,
Far.
and the question is, would you support it? Do you think it's a good idea? And what can we do to get government to take that change on board?
Absolutely. I'm a member of MIA as well, and I certainly would support that. I think the questions do need to be relevant, and the way you've put it is absolutely right. I think we should certainly support that. I think it will require proposals and lobby with the right people in government. I know you mentioned Tony Burke, Alex, and I would be very supportive of it. Yeah, absolutely.
Daniel? Oh, that's right.
Look, I have no objections. I think it's a good idea. I felt a little bit uneasy when you started speaking, though, given I think these tests have been weaponized in the past, and I think we should have I mean, these are the right forums to be having discussions about what should be in tests like this. But when it's covered in the media, I think the implication of saying we need to make these tests more stringent is an assumption that the people coming to Australia don't share the values that we want them to have, and that's a starting assumption. But it does not sound like your proposal fits into that in any way whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a question at the front here.
Hi, my name is Lynn. I reckon the idea that anchors the national conversation in Australia about migration is that Australian culture is fixed and immutable, and the migrant job is to assimilate. We as good migrants assimilate. My mother emigrated from Scotland, so I'm the daughter of a good migrant who assimilated. When I lived in Canada for 3 years some while ago, the Canadian anchor idea, so we talk about the melting pot, so we all blend out to beige, we're just one big melting pot of a beigey soup. Canada talks about being part of the Canadian mosaic. And so their idea is that their culture is continually deepening and getting richer the more waves of migration come into the country. And people describe themselves, I had friends who describe themselves as, I'm a Jewish Canadian woman, I'm a, whatever that, but you weren't just Canadian, you were something. Canadian people wore their heritage with pride. How do you think the Australian conversation about migration might change if we shifted that central anchor idea to something like a mosaic from a melting pot?
Clive.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were speaking, Lynn. I mean, the first reaction was, yes, sounds like a good idea, but, I just want to push back a little bit. I've been doing a lot of pushing back lately, getting myself into trouble. But, I think there are some aspects of mainstream, let's say traditional post-settler Australian society that we should expect immigrants to conform to. There are cultural norms, often enshrined in laws, that we all expect people to abide by, cultural moral norms. And, I'm thinking, violence against women, for example.
Which wasn't a cultural norm in law 150 years ago, Clive.
Well, of course not, but it is now. Now, that's not to say that it's not breached every day in appalling ways, but it is an expectation and enshrined in law. And so, while yes, cultural diversity and tolerance of different ways is terrific, and we from mainstream, let's say, all benefit enormously from it, I think as a general principle, it's pretty hard to make the case that there are no elements of Australian culture and morality that are negotiable or that people can pick or choose. Now, I think there is an element of conformity to the values of this culture that it's reasonable to expect people new to it conform to.
We're almost out of time, but that does raise, I think, a final point that I'd like to go to you, Clive, on, and then I might get a response from a couple of others as well, very quickly. And it is a heretical idea in a sense, and particularly when we often talk of Australia as the most successful multicultural country in the world. You often hear that phrase. Great's on me too. But we've been talking a lot about far right and some of the exploitative aspects of the immigration debate that has been seized upon. But on the left, on the progressive side, that valorises something like multiculturalism, there are inherent dangers there too. And I suppose the heretical idea is that can you have diversity and cultural difference and economic opportunities and bringing more people in here without a policy of multiculturalism, which may, in the more extreme cases, lead to a fragmented, fractured, opt-in, opt-out idea of what a national identity is, Clive? Have the limits of that in a political and social cohesive sense of multiculturalism, are we touching those limits?
Yeah, I think we have, and I think this liberal narrative of multiculturalism, which I've always adhered to, of course, certainly in principle, it is a kind of third rail in Australian politics, as it is in many places. And there are substantial communities of Australians who don't buy the liberal narrative. And, we agree on this, that dismissing that and disparaging that is, which might be our kind of gut reaction, but it's dangerous. And also, I just don't think it's right, because, our Baha'i friend, made a very eloquent case in favour of tolerance and engagement. I wonder whether the Baha'i invites some One Nation people along to practice that engagement. If not, they should.
Yes. Yes.
Then I think we make a rod for our own back.
Daniel, similarly, the differentiation between, just from my own observations, and I travel widely, I read a lot about this, the anxiety is less around the difference than it is around the idea that I am losing something of my own, which is an inevitable consequence of multiculturalism taken in extremis, because you do end up in a situation where you have people, to quote Liz Truss, who are citizens of nowhere. Is it time to rethink what that means? If we're going to just use the term multiculturalism, in 2025 that's landing very differently. Do we have to reassess what that means? And something that was dreamed up in 1975 is going to have a very different meaning in 2025.
Look, that's a great question, Stan. I think maybe I'll start with a slightly different point before coming to this, just because since it's the last word, and maybe, I guess, a word of caution, not overblow the current moment that we're in terms of the severity of the difference that we're seeing in public opinion. And I think, Clive, you were right in saying that in polling has shown that the majority of Australians think immigration levels are too high. That in part feeds off deeply held innate concerns that they have, but it's also been fueled by the fact that it's become such a hot button political issue, and political leaders are telling them that it's so. Interestingly though, it's just still not that politically salient. When people are asked to pick their number one issue that they care most about, migration does not come up very high. It's up at around 20% now, which is about where it had been steadily since pre-pandemic.
But it does feed into cost of living, housing. It is in and of its own maybe 20%, but it is a factor in so many other things.
100%. And I think, look, whether we reassess multiculturalism or not, I think it's a tricky question for me. But I think you're defining multiculturalism in a way that is very different to the way that I understand multiculturalism. And maybe that's the issue is, we have to have a conversation about what we mean by multiculturalism, and kind of feeds in also to the conversation we have about what it means to be Australian.
Indeed.
And, there are clearly some values that we can agree on as a multicultural society in terms of what defines Australia. This is I didn't get to answer the question before about what my view of Australia is. It's a place where you're given the opportunities and protection and freedom to flourish. My family came here as refugees, and we've been beneficiaries of those opportunities here. And I think regardless of the language you speak or where you come from, I think all Australians from all backgrounds would kind of agree that that's one thing. There may be others we can agree on as well. But maybe it's that conversation that we need to have. It's just what is the common ground?
And just a final observation really quickly, we'll start at the end here with you, Alex, but multiculturalism, an idea that needs to be revisited, exhausted, reassessed, redefined. Where do you sit?
We've always been, an alternative to the melting pot's always been the salad bowl, but we're just having a bit of trouble deciding whether it should be a fattoush, Caesar or whatever.
Yeah, I guess the question is, what is the grounds of unity between difference? And how do you maintain that without kind of fragmenting or separating, as you indicated, Stan?
Farhan.
I think it's a really good opportunity, to be honest with you. I think Australia is working. I travel. I think it's a beautiful country. I think multiculturalism's great. I love being an Aussie, right? I think we need political leadership to say that this is where we're going. We need to unite. I don't think at the moment, I think what we're lacking at the moment is nothing to unite us collectively, and nobody knows where we're going. We need guidance. And if we have more of that, this country will continue to be as successful as it is and beyond.
Well, and it's been wonderful to have this conversation. Again, thank you to everyone who is here, all of you online. It's so refreshing to be able to have this conversation and not in any way shy away from the hard questions, to do it in good faith, to acknowledge, as Clive and others have done, that there are people who are just not being listened to and branded unnecessarily and unfairly in ways that drive them out of the conversation and hardens those divisions. At the same time, there are people who have come here looking for a way into a country facing hostility right now. But to be able to have this conversation is the essence of what Yindyamarra is. It is listening, it is respect, it is saying where we are is more important than who we are, and all of that has been on display here in our panel. So please, everyone, thank our panellists tonight. I want to thank everyone in the room for coming. Farhan for the Rappin Sheriff Group, who were really instrumental in bringing this about. To Peter Sherlock, who is the Acting Director of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture, who has really championed this and has seen this through to what we're seeing here tonight. I want to acknowledge also Charles Sturt University, Renee Leon, who is a great supporter of what we do here, has always supported what we do in Yindyamarra, and being able to have the conversations that we need to have. I hope we can replicate this. I'd love to see the same conversation taking place in other campuses of Charles Sturt University to reach exactly the people that Clive and others have spoken about here tonight, so they can come and they can be heard and they can be respected and we can all be listened to. So we're hoping to do that in the new year as well. For now, everyone watching online, everyone here, thank you so much. Again, thanks to everyone involved. I look forward to doing it again soon. Thank you.